today we're going to work with Canto IV of Dante's Inferno, but I want to go back to a line that occurs in Canto III. Remember, in Canto III, Dante is making the crossing with Virgil, with Chiron, the ferryman, who's taking him across this first river that we found in hell, the Acheron. And Chiron is not happy about this. He's been grumbling the whole time. And there's a tercet, a three-line part of this poem that I want to read. Chiron looks at Virgil and he looks at Dante and he says, "A good soul never comes to make this crossing. So if Chiron grumbles at the sight of you, you see now that his words are what his words are really saying." So Virgil points out, it's like, hey, Chiron's not used to seeing people who don't belong here. And so it brings up an important part. Dante is not dead yet, but he has managed to make it into the underworld, and he's kind of an anomaly. He's standing out to the figures that are there. So as we move into Canto IV, one of the concepts that comes up is, are we really still in hell yet? Because we seem to have been on the outside. We've looked at these undecided, the uncommitted people who are chasing flags back and forth on this burning beach as they're stung by wasps. These are the people who couldn't decide. And we reach the first circle of hell after crossing the Acheron. And as I read it, it's going to introduce this concept called Limbo, which, let me read the first part and then we'll talk a little bit about what Limbo is and what it might have meant to Dante. So Dante has fallen asleep, maybe he's fainted, and when he wakes up, it's suddenly a heavy clap of thunder. I awoke from the deep sleep that drugged my mind, startled the way one is when shaken out of sleep. I turned my rested eyes from side to side. Already on my feet and staring hard, I tried my best to find out where I was. And this is what I saw. I found myself upon the brink of grief's abysmal valley that collects the thunderings of endless cries. So dark and deep and nebulous it was. Try as I might to force my sight below, I could not see the shape of anything. So again, it's important here, the view in hell is obscured. You cannot see beyond, like hell itself, to see salvation, to see God. And again, remember we talked about the geography. The further you proceed into hell, the farther you get from God's divinity. And so the deeper you go, the less your vision will be of salvation. And this is part of what Dante the poet is describing. "Let it descend into the sightless world," began the poet. This is Virgil. His face was deathly pale. "I will go first, and you will follow me." And I, aware of his changed color, said, "But how can I go on if you are frightened? You are my constant strength when I lose heart." And he to me, "The anguish of the souls that are down here paints my face with pity, which you have wrongly taken to be fear. Let us go, the road urges us." He entered then, leading the way for me down to the first circle of the abyss. And so what Dante encounters when he finds out from Virgil that, what is this place? He hears, it's not agony, it's just, it's grief, okay? And Virgil has changed color. He's become very pale because he explains to Dante that this is where he resides. This is the place called Limbo, which is another, think of it as like another antechamber. It's not really hell. The people here are not suffering so much as that they have no hope of reaching kind of redemption, reaching Christ's love. Limbo is reserved for virtuous people who lived before the time of Christ or who had no knowledge of Christ, and therefore, according to church teaching, they were not allowed entry into paradise. And so Limbo is the house where you find, and Dante hears like children crying too. This is where you also find unbaptized children, people who have had no knowledge of Christ, therefore they can't, under that Christian doctrine, be saved because they cannot have been baptized. So this is a concept that has been debated, back and forth theologically. The Catholic Church actually has kind of taken a step back. It was never part of official church doctrine for the Catholic Church to believe in limbo. Instead, it became part of what we call the medieval apocrypha. These are writings outside of the text that are not accepted as church canon, okay, are those books that would go with it, but many people kind of use them to fill in the gaps. And so people in the Middle Ages had questions like, what happens to people who are good people, just they never weren't Christian? So they point to, like, what about the good people who existed, in the Old Testament? What became of them? What about people who may have adopted, like, the Muslim faith, but they're virtuous people? They're good men. They're good women. They try to live a virtuous life. What happens to them? What about babies who, perish before baptism? And so all of these questions led to this creation of an idea. What if there were some sort of holding place, a place called Limbo, where these unbaptized souls would not be punished? They're not being punished for something they could never have any control over, but they are not also, they're kept out. And so that's what Dante finds in Limbo, is it's inhabited by all of these virtuous pagans as well as virtuous Muslims. So they'll mention a couple of Muslims as well here, and virtuous people who came before Christ. And Dante will ask Virgil, and he says, and I'm skipping a little bit, he says, "Tell me, my teacher, tell me, oh my master, I began wishing to have confirmed by him the teachings of unerring Christian doctrine." And here Dante's wrong. This is not Christian doctrine. This is outside of the church, although many people mistakenly believe it to be Catholic doctrine. Did any ever leave here through his merit or with another's help and go to bliss? And he who understood my hidden question answered, "I was a novice in this place when I saw a mighty Lord descend to us, who wore the sign of victory as his crown." So this is a description of what in the Orthodox Church we call the harrowing of hell. This is where Christ, after his execution, after his crucifixion on Good Friday, descends into hell on Holy Saturday to rescue or bring to the heavenly kingdom those good, virtuous church fathers: Noah, Adam, Eve, Abel, Jonah, King David, Rachel, all of those good people that were virtuous and worthy, the founders kind of what would become the Jewish faith and then eventually ultimately the Christian faith. All of those people who existed before Christ. And Virgil says, I was one of those. I was newly here. So we know Virgil died in 19 BC, so some 20 years before Christ's birth. So he too would never have had any knowledge of Christ. Therefore, as good as he was, as much as Dante upholds him, he would not have made it in the doors. And he explains that there was a time when this mighty Lord, and for Virgil, he doesn't understand Christianity, so he sees him as this great, like, warlord who is wearing this triumphant crown, descends and takes with him. He creates this giant landslide, and we'll see the landscape of that later in the Inferno, and he rescues the people from the Old Testament, the virtuous, and he brings them with him. And Dante says we were not allowed to travel with that. And then they proceed through Limbo, and Dante encounters many of the great faces of the people that he would have studied and he would have been admiring and would have almost worshipped or idealized. Guys like Homer, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all those members of the pagan kind of philosophical poetic school that Dante admires, and he sees them lined up everywhere, and they begin to talk to him. And Virgil has this wonderful like introduction, like, hey, this is Dante, and everybody says, Dante, yeah, you're going to be great. And he talks to them, and they begin to talk back and forth about the craft of writing poetry. And here again we see Dante isolates himself away from the philosophers and starts to talk to the poets, because he thinks both of those fields have a realm in your salvation, but it's through poetry and hopefully through the work that he's creating that we will find, the doorway or the key to our own salvation. And so Dante works his way through Limbo, and it's almost like he's trapped. He feels badly for these people, but he wants to stay because that intellectual, educational part of him wants to be there. And then suddenly they start to fall away, and as they leave this place, they'll notice that Dante is with Virgil, and they're by themselves, and they travel on, and now they will move into the next level of hell, which is where we first see our first like tormented or punished sinners, and that will be the land where we find the lustful caught in this huge maelstrom or whirlpool or tornado. of grief and sorrow. So we'll save that for next time.